So good evening, good afternoon, good morning, everyone, wherever you are. It's wonderful to welcome everyone to our final series of Time to Rename Aid. I am pleased to be your moderator for the day. My name is Hamimu Masudi. I work with Health Poverty Action, and I'm also the co-chair of the Track Changing Initiative of the Kampala Initiative. This is the subgroup that Ravi has told you about that is mandated with researching and finding better narratives for describing some of the concepts that we use in development. I would like to thank you for joining this conversation. It's great to have you. We could not be pleased with the panel that we have today. It's a great one. They will each say something about themselves when that time comes, but I want to give a perspective on each one of them. So we have Dr. Danny Gauto. You can see the title, doctor. He's a doctor by training. He's also a member of the Track Changing Initiative. And with him, we have been, organizing the series, and he hosted one on Uganda. He also runs his own organization that tries to address some of these issues. He'll be telling you more about it. Then we have Mariam Mohsin, media and communication person from Bond. She'll tell you more about Bond and what they're trying to do on this subject. I won't let the cat out of the box. We have Joan Okito. She'll also come on board and tell you more about herself and the kind of work she's doing. I also have Tamam Aludat. I'll just say something that she is a writer, but he'll tell you more about himself when his time comes. We have Martin Rory, who is the CEO of Health Poverty Action, and he will also be telling us more about how he is associated with this whole issue. He's also my boss, I must say that. We have Catalina from Chile. Catalina will also be telling us more about herself. And finally, we have Monica Yata. I hope she has signed in, but she will also come and also tell us more about herself. But before I could open the floor so that each one of these speakers can tell you something about themselves and try to join the conversation, let me say a few things about this whole program. So how did we decide to organize this consultation process? It's an interesting question. But anyone who has attempted to understand the history of global poverty, poor health and inequalities in places like Latin America, Asia and Africa, and within countries, even in the global north, he or she will not fail to learn about historical injustices from slave trade to colonialism. One will also realize how the current neoliberal economic models, including the charity model, the aid model, is leading to the plunder of billions of dollars from these weak countries, the poor ones, in the so-called global south. So someone will always know that any person who has been involved in development won't miss to find this as a truth that explains why we have poor health and why we have global poverty. So at the Track Changing Initiative, we realized that we have to stop this so-called aid language because of some of the reasons we have given. We think it undermines the cause of global justice. it undermines the true global solidarity that we need to tackle these problems. It creates victims and saviors. So we have been here, 2020 was an interesting year. It was a breaking point between the outbreak of the deadly COVID pandemic and the massive protests that you saw across cities in America, rising up against racial injustices, and also the climate change protests that we have been seeing being led by the young people. The world was shaken because of these all events, and the systemic inequalities were brought to the fore. And it is these that somehow pushed us. They gave us this push that we need to do something about this. And we also read very many reports. We've been attending conferences, and we've been seeing how concepts are being misused, trying to describe poverty and trying to describe the financial relationships between wealthy countries and poor and the weak countries. And we said we needed to make a consultation and find an appropriate language to describe this relationship, because we think it's not appropriate. The words that we are currently using is not appropriate. They are not helping in us solidifying our movement and moving forward. So that's where we're coming from, and that's what pushed us. So this consultation has two levels. We've been, having a series of these webinars, but we've also been having an online survey. You'll have access to it, and we'll be very glad if you participate. At some point, we shall give you more details. You watch out the chat box. But I would want to briefly say what the purpose of this webinar is. So we want to add to the debate on the role of language in contributing to wider global inequalities, including masking current power dynamics between global North and global South. We want to underscore the importance of language in determining thought process, action, and reaction. Debate ways on how to decolonize the language of hate, and then collect as many ideas for renaming the so-called hate. That's our purpose. So in this global webinar, this final one, it is the very, very last one. We've had a series of them in countries, and we have learned a lot, and we have received a lot of contributions and ideas from countries. One of the speakers will be telling us what has transpired at some point. But I want to say that this webinar has a limitation. We are not trying to claim that changing a word will solve all of our problems. That is not true. So this process, this webinar and the online surveys recognize that there are many power imbalances within international development and the aid industry itself. And it is absolutely clear that language alone won't solve them. But it's our belief that decolonizing our language and communicating honestly about the causes of global inequality is a step towards exposing global power inequalities. Just wanted to make that disclaimer clear. So without much ado, let me invite our first speaker, Dr. Danny Gauto, to tell us his ideas, his opinions about this whole consultation process. He will be telling us more about what he has learned as a practitioner, but also what he has learned organizing a series on this same process. Over to you, Danny.
Yes, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're coming from, and I'm glad to be here. It's my pleasure and honor, Hamim, that you've introduced me. Just to reiterate a bit, I am Danny Gauto, I'm from Uganda. by naturalization, and I've been here since, I was 10 years old. I'm a practitioner, for the last 15 years, and I can say I've been a beneficiary of aid because much of my work life has been in the aid space. So I've worked with each and every big cat in the game, particularly the USAID boys and DFID, which later translated to some acronym I'm failing to remember. So my experience with the narrative of aid started way back as, someone employed by the institutions, and I've quite picked a couple of lessons. If you'd allow me, I prepared a couple of slides for people to follow. But I will start with a story. When I was a young man around 2000 or slightly before, my father came with a news article. I think it was News Times or something. It was a magazine. And that magazine sort of depicted the future of Africa with a very interesting, captivating story, which talked about, which said, I'm trying to get the presentation. Okay, just one second. Which this article talked about that by the year 2030, nearly 60% of Africans will be infected with HIV. So of course, my father, knowing that we were adolescents, he used it as a scarecrow to make us, I think that is his own way of messaging to us. But that highlights how the media frames discussions. Then growing up, of course, interacting with aid, I got firsthand experiences of how narratives were created in the global north. Now, just this year, we did an assessment of a survey where we sort of tried to analyze the coloniality within the aid space. And I came to find that the story of aid, the narrative of aid starts with media, the global north media. It frames the question, often half truth or far away from the truth. Of course, assisted with academia that kind of channel a lot of very good English and concepts. Now, immediately after that, politics picks it up. A good example is the Omicron variant that came from Africa and how politics has pandered to it and saying all sorts of things. Now, if we look at the slides that I'm showing, of course, the impact is real to some countries. How other countries have been denied the space or the travel and opportunity just because they are feared more. You've seen the climate conference in Glasgow, where, of course, photo opportunities come, promises are made, but nothing tangible is coming through. We've seen politicians giving buzzwords, build back better, nobody knows. But aid has always been moving on knee-jerk reactions and sometimes not well thought out policies. So politics has always been promising a lot, many pledges and unfulfilled promises. Moving forward, we've seen that with the politics in the play or in the picture, sometimes aid has been coming through. Now, I'm trying to project a picture there of who benefits from aid. Now, from my experience, having worked in the aid space for the last couple of years, I have seen that most of the times, the narrative that was shared was often an exaggeration. Far from the truth, but because somebody using their connections from the media and academia have defined the problem, described it, and created shape of it. And that problem is what informed the investment. We've also seen aid failing to recognize that the people that are doing something in communities are already doing something to help themselves. And then it chants the idea that, okay, they are waiting to be served. You can remember the Ebola crisis. You can look at the HIV crisis. You can now see the COVID, where somebody said somewhere in one of the big philanthropies saying, we're going to be picking dead bodies on the streets of Africa. The healthcare system is crumbling. Here we are, we're still surviving. So we've seen aid agencies taking advantage of the narrative, getting the money, of course, and of course, playing the grantees with their own politics. Now, we took, in that analysis that I told you, we analyzed aid reports of most of the prominent agencies in Uganda on how they state the problem, on how much they recognize local efforts, on how much they state their impact, or link the contributions of local communities. Comrades, it is negligible in all, talk about all of them. What they only mention, we've subgranted X amount of money to these local organizations. They do not mention what the local organizations brought in the picture. They do not mention the original efforts that the communities where they went had done. And it is sort of like they have done us a great favor for bringing the investment. Now, of course, that narrative nurtures dependency and complexes that are, to some people, inferiority complexes or superiority complexes that really make the feel-good effect for some who give money. Now, I thought I would bring in what is the implication of this on people who live on both sides of the equation. Of course, starting with those who live in countries that give aid, we are seeing that they are very unsure about the impact of aid, and some are pushing it back. They are fatigued with the dependence idea and burden and the language. And we've seen that because they are thinking that they're spending more money, they're even shunning away migrations, and the majority of them are less informed about the truth about aid. Of course, I don't need to say about the neocolonial bourgeoisies that have emerged because of the distortion within the aid. And those are also pushing their own narrative and claiming their importance just because they have big money. To us as people in the recipient countries, we are seeing aid indoctrinating more people, creating more discrimination, determining who gets and who doesn't, and sort of creating confusion within the space that NGOs are now running around trying to create problem statements and programs that really anchor themselves to who is giving money. Of course, we have seen tired solutions that have no impact, failed promises like localization, debt burdens increasing, and then of course the distortion of the space in terms of trade and the economic imbalances and exploitation. We continue to see failed governance, restrictive immigration, and of course, needless to say about the COVID vaccine appetite. So for me, if I would end on this slide and say, where are the opportunities for us to reimagine solidarity and have a honest conversation about the problems that we're trying to do? Of course, cognizant of the fact that changing the narrative alone will not address all the problems that we have within the aid space. But this is going to the global north comrades who are fighting the struggle from that part of the world. We need to emphasize from our side that the Western world must come down from their high horses to understand that there is history to all these problems, to fix their fragility and become thick-skinned when we tell them we speak from our hearts. Two, we want them to educate themselves and deal with the bias. They must understand, for instance, that slavery did not end with this white British man whom they study in schools that ended slavery. DEI isn't enough. It is another token. They must appreciate that. They must also acknowledge that we must have conversation about expiation or atonement. They must also help us to confront the racists in their yard, and then of course address the power and politics that gives with one hand and takes away. On our side, we are saying that we must be assertive, like I am now, to say what it is and how it is. Please give us the audience, and I'm glad this is happening. We must, come together as a community to address this in solidarity, like we're doing. Of course, we need to educate ourselves. We need to confront power, because we know power cannot just give. We need to tussle for it. And then, of course, we need to resist the temptation of tokenism.
Okay,
so
thanks a lot.
I should end it at that. And I'll have another conversation when my colleagues come in. Thank you.
All right, thanks a lot, Dr. Danny. That's really very helpful. Thanks for giving us that perspective, how aid is constructed in Africa, the role of aid agencies and politics shaping the narrative, the implications of the aid narrative on the public, and then the opportunities to reimagine, recreate. We shall open up a discussion. We shall discuss amongst the speakers. We shall have that opportunity. Then we shall also open up at some point so that we have an interaction with our audience. We are looking forward to that moment. So look out for that. So thanks a lot. Let me take this moment now to invite Mariam Mohsin. Mariam, you'll tell us how you're associated with this whole issue of aid narrative. Tell us a bit about it and about yourself, and then go for it. You have 5 minutes. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. And I mean, it's reassuring to listen to a lot of what Dr. Danny Gauto said, because a lot of that will mirror what I'm about to say, which is always reassuring. But firstly, huge thanks to Compiler Initiative for inviting me to take part in this critical conversation, and also just the opportunity to listen and learn to the conversation that will take place after we've all kind of given you our perspective on this important issue, but also the opportunity to listen to the other panelists. So in a nutshell, my name's Mariam. I'm the head of media and communications here at Bond, and we are based in the UK. We are the UK network for organisations working in international development and humanitarian assistance, big and small, from across the UK. Over a year ago now, myself and some of my colleagues had a very similar conversation about the need to look in the mirror and face up to many of the words and phrases that we use in our advocacy and communications that perpetuate the very issues that Dr. Danny just mentioned. It's those moments where you feel uncomfortable with the phrases that you use, but you continue to use them. That's what we were looking to hone in on and actually actively address, rather than just feeling uncomfortable. And it's been fantastic to get support from both Health Poverty Action, but also the Compiler Initiative with that piece of work. And we've seen that actually have a significant knock-on effect across the UK NGO sector, which again is incredibly reassuring, and suggests that there's appetite to really confront this issue head on, but not just hopefully tokenistically, actually embrace it and reflect on it and use it. So in a nutshell, so I'm going to be speaking from the perspective of the UK and a lot of the work that we do in our advocacy work. But from what I've seen in a lot of the language that we use, and I like the way that you use the phrase global solidarity, because ultimately that is what we are supposed to be achieving and aspiring towards here. Yet so much of the language that we use is either overly complicated, using phrases like capacity development or even like localization. What do these words mean in practice? And does the practice even mirror the intention behind those words? Sometimes, quite often it doesn't. So it's about thinking about the language that we're using to simplify it, but also it's about this idea, this them and us. There's a lot of that happens in a lot of our communications and how we talk about the very work that we do, either through our language, but also the visuals that we use. And it smacks to this idea that somehow we are heroes that are sweeping in to save victims of an unknown issue that we're not really going to talk about in detail because it's just too complicated and people just won't understand. I think in our quest to ensure that we are using the right message for the right audience, so anyone that works in communications will have had that conundrum. What is it that we should say in order to gain entry to a politician, an MP, a minister, to get them to agree or at least speak to us about this issue, so we can then convince them of X, Y, and Z. My concern is that we've neglected the message to such an extent, and we're so busy worrying about who it is that we're speaking to, that we've almost forgotten what it is that we're, trying to achieve in the first place, i.e. a fairer, equitable, just, safe, sustainable world, and, for the people that live on this planet. So are we getting to the stage where the types of things that we would say to an MP or a minister, we would never say to a community or somebody who works in an organization in Uganda? If that's the case, there is a huge problem there. And that's not to say that you shouldn't think about audience and messaging, but the apple just shouldn't fall so far away from the tree that it actually turns into a pear. And these are some of the ways that I think that we unintentionally, I hope, undermine this solidarity agenda that we should be aspiring towards. In terms of what needs to change, there needs to be an acknowledgement that language is just not appropriate anymore. The terms and phrases that we use just are no longer appropriate. They're not fit for purpose. And they do a huge disservice to what it is we're trying to do, but also the communities and the people that we work with ultimately in countries around the world. And I do find it reassuring to see that there are so many organisations and people and individuals, many of them are here taking part in this event and on this panel, that are pushing us to a much better place on this agenda. But this can't be the start of the conversation. And I think UK NGOs as power holders, because there is so much money in richer, higher income countries and money talks, we have a responsibility to make sure that we're driving an agenda and practicing some of the stuff that we talk about, because that's the thing that I often hear. How do we turn these things into something that actually achieves what it is that we're talking about when we're not just a bunch of rhetoric and hot air? For me, phrases and languages that I think are problematic. So, I would say Global South is problematic. We're not talking about New Zealand or Australia in reality, are we? And should where we're located on the globe really dictate whether we can become richer or poorer? I think that there's an issue there. And I think that that's a neo-colonial term that was there to replace third world, but I think it actually does exactly the same thing. It's inaccurate and it perpetuates the problem. And again, the words that we use, it tells everyone, we're imposing our worldview on everyone else. This is how we see the world, and this is the language that we're going to use. And this is going to tell you, this is the power dynamics that we think is at play here, without having any self-awareness of the implications and impact that has on ultimately what we're trying to achieve, which again is a more equitable, just planet, effectively. Again, beneficiaries is another one that I take huge issue with. Are we really saying that communities are passive benefactors of our help? I mean, look at the power dynamics that's inherent in that word. We need to just stop using it. So words matter. They set the tone, they tell everyone our approach, and they tell everyone what our mindset is. And if you're not going into an issue or a project that you're working with in partnership with the community with the right mindset, you're basically perpetuating the problem. So basically, I think also here in the UK, I'll just talk about the word aid very quickly. So aid is often used as shorthand for foreign aid or UK aid, which in and of itself has negative kind of perceptions and connotations with it. Again, we have no control over this political narrative that has an agenda in the UK, and yet it's very largely associated with the work that we also do, and yet we have no control over it. And it also sanitizes the issue here. It removes all of the historical colonial legacy around aid, it basically somehow removes what it is that's taking place here, away from all of the things that are perpetuating poverty, insecurity. It ignores the geopolitics of what's happening. It's almost like aid's just the answer. We're just going to give somebody some money and that's going to be the solution, as opposed to acknowledging that poverty is fundamentally political. Like, that's what's going on here. But it sanitizes it, basically to make it slightly more comfortable for the people that, you know, are having to listen and hear a lot of our communications or advocacy work. Also, you could argue, if all we're doing is just providing aid, then why do we need to have conversations about social justice, or, you know, or do advocacy work, trying to influence policymakers? Again, we're doing it because poverty is political, and yet by using such simplistic and patronizing language, we're undermining what it is that we're actually engaging with, but also what it is that's actually the solution to a lot of the issues that are being perpetuated. So what needs to change? I think we as a sector here in the UK, we need to be much, much more self-aware. We need to really hold the mirror up to ourselves, but also just look at ourselves very hard and long, and basically acknowledge what it is that we need to fundamentally do to address these issues. And language is just one tiny component of it. It's an important one, and it's one that I do think is almost an entry point into lots of other issues. But it's about, you know, making sure that asking who's got the seat at the table in terms of making decisions. You know, how do we bring young voices into the conversation? You know, is it appropriate that an NGO that's based in the UK is around this table, or should it actually be somebody or an organization in a country that we're trying to represent here? You know, all of these questions need to be asked to be able to fundamentally address these issues. And also, it's about money ultimately. You know, we should be aspiring towards money going directly to actually organizations and people and communities that are on the ground. So then the question is, what role do NGOs play in all of this? And that needs to be ultimately bottomed out very, very quickly if we are going to be able to get to the place that we need to be. I'm just going to do a very quick plug here, but in a nutshell, you know, what I'm saying is the UK NGOs hold a lot of power here, and we really need to commit ourselves to this agenda, but also to being much more diverse and inclusive in how we approach a lot of this work. And one of the things that Bond's doing, so it's a myriad of things, because we feel at Bond that we have a responsibility to encourage and push organisations in the UK in the right direction on this agenda. So we've got a series of events called Future Dialogues, and they're about unpacking and forcing people to have those uncomfortable conversations that shouldn't be uncomfortable because it's just the truth, in order to air some of the issues that might be holding us back to progressing forward much faster on a lot of this agenda. And you know, when you look at what's happening with COVID-19 and how that's being handled, or climate change, it just shows you that the system that we've got right now isn't working. It's out of date. It benefits, you know, the rich at the expense of, you know, lower income countries, and that just needs to stop if we want to get to a place where we have a much more equitable world, and ultimately we would all benefit from that. I'm going to stop there. I hope that's okay, and I haven't run over time.
Wow, great. Many thanks, Mariam, for that presentation. Just on point. You really brought out almost all the issues about UK. But what has stood out for me, the key message, the takeaways, is the imposition of worldviews on communities across the world. So the cultural and ideological positions of the UK is imposed, let's say, on communities down there in rural Uganda, which is not right. And some of these communities could not even agree with you when you're defining development, which of course you've also said is problematic. So for example, the indigenous communities do not agree that the current development is the right one. It's destroying the environment. Their definition of development is different. So this aid whole narrative creates that problem, the imposition of views, one community views onto the rest of the world. I've also picked out the issues of aid and development and global north and global south. So there are very many words, it's not just aid that is problematic. So, but we're dealing with aid today another day, probably another player, another actor will pick up on this and also discuss them in depth. We were meant to have Monica Yatta. Unfortunately, she's having connection issues and she hasn't made it to the panel. So she comes from the indigenous communities. She's on the, she is the founder, Indigenous Women and Girls Initiative, and member of Indigenous Women's Council. She was meant to come and tell us more about the colonization that is still being carried forward against their communities, against indigenous communities. Because we know that at the core of it all, colonization is about returning the lands and the people who were taken away. So I think Tamam will tell us more about that. But she was going to tell us more about the current global climate crisis that is affecting her community, the drought in northeastern Kenya, and how maybe the aid that is being sent there is understood as charity. To her, she's saying that is not charity. Their community doesn't contribute to global warming at all. This should be something else. We'd call it something else, probably compensation or something. That was at the core of her message. I'm trying to summarize what she was going to say, but she has not made it. So in her absence, I've made somehow a key message about her presentation, but I'll ask Catalina, if you are ready, you could step in and have your 5 minutes, and please educate us about your context, Southern America.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello, everybody. I see you in the central screen of this. Is there any way for me to pass to the main screen? Because I look myself in the side, but I don't know if you look at me the same way. I can't hear you.
Catalina, I think
I think my center, so I don't know.
Okay, so you
it
can
depends
see
on,
me.
yeah, we can see you well.
Okay, great, sure. Okay, so first of all, thanks a lot for inviting me. I think this is a really important and relevant space for us to be in, and a really great topic to talk about, and it's necessary for us to discuss about these issues from a critical perspective. So in order to introduce myself, my name is Catalina Salazar. I used to be regional coordinator for United Network of Young Peace Builders in America, and I'm also a member of Social Hip Hop NGO, and we work in different places in Latin America. So thanks for inviting me. And okay, so before starting, I think it is good to make the exercise to situate ourselves, and that is, I think, to state where we speak from when we speak of aid, or when we speak about almost anything, I would say. And in the first place, I want to say they represent a very unequal region, which is Latin America, also, characterized by a strong colonialism. And this colonialism is expressed in different ways according to time. It has been expressed in different paths and ways of manifesting this colonialism. So now, as far as my interpretation goes, I think in our current times, this is expressed through extractivism and basically the depredation of our natural resources, based of course, in some other structural colonialism, such as mass media, etc. But those are the main ones I want to focus on. And from there is where that space and that place is where I want to speak to you. So when we speak of international aid, international cooperation, or some other like words that might come to your mind, from a decolonial perspective, there are, I would say, quite a few biases that we must address. In the first place, there's of course the bias of language, and because by having an universal language and that being English, of course, that makes automatically all the other languages invisible. And of course, it's a way of showing this unequal balance of powers. On the other hand, there's also a presupposition around the idea of development, of growth even, which and even I would say maybe sustainable development, which is used a lot to, depending on that, it's a lot to develop aid initiatives. And however, I think that vision, in my opinions, tends to be a bit of like homogenizing point, I'm sorry for my English, since it assumes that there's only one way to achieve development. There's one way, and sometimes it includes a way of seeing societies and an ideal of society. And that is precisely that idea that is based on fairly, I would say most of the time, a lot of Eurocentric notions and Eurocentric nations, of course. But on the other hand, it gives the impression that international aid, which I prefer to call cooperation, and even I would say interdependence, that international aid addresses those problems that are the results of other problems, but does not take charge, for example, of huge interventionism that we face as a region, and the way that decisions are taken. And of course, it goes without saying that the spaces that define sometimes huge interventions in the international policies that rule us, they don't always consider the country that will receive that aid or be intervened. And in generally, that doesn't work very well from my perspective. Okay, so those are things that I would like to highlight. And finally, because I don't want to extend too much, maybe you can discuss about it in the question and answer or something. But finally, I think this is not about criticizing everything, but about looking for other ways, such as a more horizontal cooperation between countries and societies or communities, even based on their potential, promoting the exchange of languages other than English, maybe, and above all, understanding that each community, country, or society has its own processes. And this is the word so diverse that any universal idea might not be feasible. And there I prefer to speak of multiverses instead of universe. Today, we're going through an unprecedented climate and political crisis. And perhaps, maybe, it is time to look at what models of society have always existed. Indigenous communities, for example, which in many respects, I will say they can even be an example and not just a group of people who need aid. And thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Catalina, for that wonderful presentation. I think you have raised the key points, but I think just when you're wrapping up, you did raise a pertinent issue that shouldn't go unanswered. I think you have clearly put it that English, okay, is not the only language, okay? So we're looking for an alternative English word for aid, yet we know that the world is complex, and that's a good one. Probably someone will respond to that during their presentation. But where we stand at Kampala Initiative, we know that the vocabulary is complex and widespread, and each community should be having their own definition of the relationship they're having with financial aid. So I think probably we are starting now, and we're trying to be as bold as possible, but at the same time, we are hopeful that these conversations will be carried forward by other communities speaking different languages, and finding an appropriate, a dignified definition of this relationship between the aid agencies and also the so-called recipient communities. So thanks a lot for that. And I'll now turn to Tamam Alaudat. Please take the floor. You have 5 minutes. Take over.
Thank you very much. It's a privilege to be here, and thank you for having me. The issue of language is fascinating, and some of the main issues that were mentioned here are absolutely pertinent. It's very difficult to follow that meaningfully. So thank you to to Donny and to Miriam and to Catalina. The way I've confronted this, and this is, I mean, the first thing we have to acknowledge is aid and the language that it uses is used to mask some stuff that are pretty bad. And let's consider first is, you say aid, and you get this fuzzy feeling inside of good things happening. Ignoring the fact that actually a big chunk of aid is military aid, and some of it is military aid to quite tyrannical regimes and entities. We don't think of military aid when we think of aid. The language is usually used to mask. But then language is also used to have a few functions, at least inside our daily life as people who work in development, in assistance, in solidarity, and so on. And one of them is communication, like exchange of data. In that sense, it's meaningful to have a single language. Let's have English. Why use one of those complicated languages that no one knows when everybody knows English already? So fine, question that comes frequently when you talk about language is why English? So English is a repository of knowledge and ends up being the singular language, the way we come to understand the world around us, to describe ourselves and others, is not neutral and stems out from a particular usage. And English is a perfect colonial language. English is the language the white man's burden was written on, the road to Mendeley was written on. It's a language that I've spoken every day for 25 years and still cannot read a poem in. It's a language of detachment. When I come from an Arabic-speaking country, this will never be my language. But the distortion is that we are taught to use it in its most practical use. So I can go on an interview and wing it in English without preparation about a topic I know well. When I need to give an interview in my mother tongue now, 20-something years later, I have to sit beforehand and recalibrate myself because I don't know all the terms in Arabic. I have to remember them. I have to invent some of them because they don't even exist in Arabic and readily. But then language is also a way of marking belonging and entitlements. In certain organizations that might be British or from English-speaking or French-speaking countries, not speaking that language well is, just like in society, a marker of exclusion. Just like someone, you could be whatever you want. If you speak Cockney, you're not going to get a job in a bank in London. And language and accent is a marker of belonging and status. It is a marker of inclusion and exclusion, both globally and individually. The fact that we have so much jargon in English in the aid sector is a way of excluding everybody from understanding or scrutinizing or holding the aid sector accountable. It is a way of making knowledge that emanates from communities that do not speak English unknowable to the aid sector, hence impossible to include. When talk about health, the way health and healing and the relationship of people to them, to their bodies, to their communities, and the way they describe their pain and the way they seek aid is different in every language. And interpreters between patients and, temporary aid workers are never going to persuade us to understand what people are talking about. It makes it easier to provide algorithmic, reductive management for people that ignores their needs and applies a stripped down, imperfect, actually not good enough healthcare in that case to them without having to haggle with needing to fulfill people's needs. Language is in itself, I would say, it's easy for anyone to say, we've been doing this forever. Let's just ignore those like squabbles, meaningless squabbles, and go, about our business of saving lives. And I'm not being sarcastic here. This sentence was told to me repeatedly, our business of saving lives. While we do that, and as well as we can do that, and as we ignore the opportunity cost of the massive industry of aid and development and what could have been done differently, language is the canary in the mine. Language being an indicator of an exclusionary, Western-centric, continuing legacy of colonialism. Why is it so difficult to change language? If you tell people, this is an offensive, exclusionary language, the normal response should be, fine, tell us how to do it better. But that's not the response we get today, because it is serving a function of sustaining a status quo that disempowers people. When we call people beneficiaries, we're defining them just by their need, by their dependence on us. They stop being people, they become only receptacles of our humanitarian goodness. And those receptacles have no opinion. This is not aid. Let's change one word. If this is called reparations, how does it change everything around it? Language is relevant and should be considered as seriously as we can afford it to be. Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks a lot, Tamam Aludat, for that wonderful presentation, thought-provoking. And I'm sure it's going to provoke more questions. Yeah? So if there are questions from the audience, please use the chat box. We'll pick this up when we open up for discussion and read out some of them. I've seen one from David Sclay about the history of books, the absence of history of books in the UK that allude to the role of colonialism, the government, and also its place in role in colonialism. So bring more questions. We are capturing this, and we shall be opening up for a discussion. Now it's space for Joan Okito to take over and give us your thoughts. You're welcome, Joan.
Yeah, thanks, Hamimu. I hope you can all hear me. My name is Joan Okito Isaac, and I'm originally from Kenya, but I'm working as a communications consultant in Geneva. And I'm here today basically wearing kind of different hats as a Black communicator, living in a dominant culture, but also as someone who is part of the Healing Solidarity Collective, which is basically an intersectional feminist community that brings and houses people together who are interested in reimagining change in the development sector. So I'm going to sort of go through my 5 points, but I'm not going to belabor some of them because I think a lot of our speakers have kind of touched on them. But nonetheless, I'd like to start off by emphasizing again that the language that we currently use in our sector, it really conveys the power dynamics, upon which the sector is built. This colonial and this racist, basically, foundation upon which the development or the aid sector is built. And it sort of conveys who is the insider, who is the outsider. Words like empowering or expert versus beneficiary, like Tamam just mentioned, or capacity building, or even expressions like giving a voice to the voiceless. They all just, communicate that idea of who has the power and who doesn't have the power. Alongside, the jargon that we use, like when we say things like we're liaising with the stakeholders on capacity building, like it's very much bubble speak, so to say. People only in our sector understand that, but through that jargon, we're kind of saying something without really being very clear to other people who are outside the sector to understand what really we're doing. And in that way, we're kind of undermining the solidarity that we're working towards because we are enclosing ourselves also, in the sector. And the second thing that I'd like to mention is when we think about the stories that we're telling, particularly in communications, I often ask, so who is telling the story and how is it being told? And I think that we still center the donor a lot of the times in the stories that we tell. And the current narrative, that is spelt out in our sector is very simplistic. So we have a problem, and then the donor comes with the money or with the funding, and then the expected outcome is supposed to be happiness or something like that. So basically the donor has a magic wand, and the systemic issues, which are very deep, and they really kind of complicate even the success stories which donors are asking for. Those are not factored into the communication that is provided later on. So the communications work in many places. It still centers the donors, but not the communities. Yet the donor is in very many ways enabling, but the actual people who are doing the work, that members of the community, they're the primary doers, whose voices we don't get to hear enough of. And just, focusing on the community, I'd like to move on to my next point, which is expanding or thinking about expanding who is a development practitioner and how aid is quantified a lot of the times in monetary terms. And I think Danny also talked about this. So I think that our definition of a development practitioner is still very much limited to the amount of money organizations or individuals are able to bring forward. And the more money you're able to bring, the more newsworthy you are, and the more visibility that you get. But then when I look at Kenya, for example, when we have a famine in northern Kenya, the first people who usually step into action are the Kenya Red Cross. And what do? They send out a message, using the local media channels, asking people to send M-Pesa or mobile money transfer so that they can provide the food supplies to the locals. But then the Kenya Red Cross is rarely ever featured as sort of like as a worthy development partner, or as a worthy development practitioner, in the sense that they're not championed as much as, let's say, if the World Food Program come in and then they provide the food supplies. And in that way, I feel like also, the narrative around who is a development practitioner is just centering again, on the big organizations and on the donors. And if you also look at people in the diaspora who are sending money every month to, family or friends to start a business or to educate family members. I mean, I consider these people also as development practitioners, and I think they also need to be centered, in this narrative of moving aid towards solidarity. And then my next point is about, the internalized inferiority complex that basically is continuously perpetuated by aid. And I say this because the colonial project was in very many ways an extractive and oppressive process. And that has meant that, in a lot of the former colonized countries, there's an internalized inferiority complex, which kind of, which is also fed by the Eurocentric and Western-centric narrative that we see in the aid sector. So we see that, for example, for myself as a Black communicator, it's very important that I constantly interrogate and analyze and, and learn in the work that I'm doing, so that I'm not repeating or perpetuating harmful messages. And just to give an example about this, so a few years ago, once after I moved to Geneva, I basically hired someone from the minority countries. I'm saying minority countries instead of the global north, and majority countries for the global south. And I hired this person to basically help me to refine my CV as I started looking for work. And one of the things that she wrote on my CV in the summary was, giving voice to the voiceless. And, it really didn't sit very well with me the first moment when I saw that, until later on I was like, no, I can't do this, because I mean, seriously, that would be me perpetuating that harmful message that we see in the sector. And I don't want to be part of that, especially not as a Black woman. And the last point I'd like to talk about is it's the Global Communicators Connect. And this is basically part of the Healing Solidarity collective, which I mentioned, you know, it's a big community of people who are reimagining change in the development sector. And within the Global Communicators Connect, myself and my good friend Jennifer Lentfer, we basically invite communicators from both the developing and the developed world, or from the minority and the majority countries, to have honest and in-depth conversations, you know, about the power asymmetries, you know, the global inequalities that we work in. And we want, you know, the communicators to talk about everyday dilemmas in reimagining how communications can be done better. So this is sort of going in the same direction to what also Marianne mentioned, you know, the events that they're holding, sort of like building this community where, you know, people who are interested in communicating better and communicating in the direction of global solidarity, they feel supported and they feel, you know, they feel like they're not alone, because I think this work definitely needs also a sense of community. And as my good friend Jennifer usually says, liberation is in the expansion of choices and options, which may be obscured by family, religion, society, or the rules we've been given. But what if those rules are limiting? So that's how I'm gonna stop there.
Great. Yet another great presentation. Thanks a lot, Joanne, for that. My takeaway, I think you touched on the issue of inferiority, and yeah, it's a conversation that we've been having also on the side. So where we are coming from, the abuses that you get subjected to, the exploitation that you get subjected to through the historical experiences that you go through, the injustices, that somehow has an impact on yourself. You internalize these messages, and the way you approach the world is from you know, that perspective of I am inferior, which can easily be understood and explained and can be overcome over time. But the problem with the aid narrative is that it perpetuates this. Okay, it still holds former communities that were originally colonized and exploited to feel inferior, to feel that they are at the mercy of someone with a good heart somewhere who will come and give them money. They cannot build on their own agency to exploit their own environment and get themselves out of this trap. That's a very strong point, Joanne. Thank you very much for that. So we are heading to our final speaker before we open up for a discussion. Martin, take it over from here.
Okay, thanks, Hamimu, and brilliant contributions from all the comrades that have spoken. What I think I don't want to repeat a lot of the things that have already been said better than I could say them. One point I particularly want to pick up, which I think is so key, is that in our sector, we're engaged in a political struggle. Our work is about politics. It's about political change. And to achieve political change, it's absolutely pivotally important that you start with educating about the issues, building a movement. And if the message is wrong, then the political change that it results in is going to be wrong. So we've got to use language that defines our cause in the right way, that educates in the right way. And so the language that we use is pivotally important. And it's good and right that we keep analysing it and thinking about it to make it more effective. But in these webinars, in this series, we're focusing specifically on one word, and I'm going to make it two just here because I think they're so interconnected. And that is the language of, and that is the word aid and the word development, the A word and the D word. Because every time we say those words, they're the words that are used to define the sector that we're part of. That's our name. It's used to define our cause. And those words encapsulate a narrative. And it's a narrative that always focuses attention as the problem being the poor or poor nations. So they're underdeveloped. And their problem is they need to develop to be like the developed nations. Or they need charity. They're poor, they're needy, they need a generous benefactor. There's a narrative in both of those words, and it's a narrative that is rooted in colonialism. That's where it historically came from, and colonialism is rooted in racism. Every time we use the A word and the D word, we perpetuate those attitudes, we perpetuate racism, and we have to stop. We've got to stop using them, and they're not necessary. Development also means, to most of the world, it means economic growth. That's not what we're about. That's not what we mean. What we mean, I think, is progression towards global equity, equity between nations and equity within nations. Why not call ourselves a global equity sector, for want of something better? But I don't think we'll ever get to a stage where we've agreed these are the new words. We've had all the global dialogue and this is the decision, this is the new word. We're not going to get to that. But we can all recognize that the A word and the D word are profoundly offensive and profoundly damaging to our cause. So let's stop using them. Let's see what catches on. Majority world, minority world, I agree, is far better language. And we have a majority world and a minority world in every country of the world. They're not geographically dispersed equally anymore. And thirdly, because I think at the end of my 5 minutes, it's not enough for us to intellectually talk about it. To achieve change, to get the sector, to get our movement, let's call it a movement rather than a sector, to get to start using words that will further our cause, we're going to have to organize. So we do need to, all our organizations, as a matter of absolute discipline, stop using the A word, stop using the D word, let's start to use alternatives and call each other out. We can be nice about it, but when we see those words used, call them out. That's how words like chairman stop being used. Now we talk about chair. That language matters. It happens because attention's drawn to it. We've all got those habits. We've used them for decades. So we're all going to need help to start changing our habits. But let's do it and let's organize to do it. If, as Taman said, if we went a month, if the sector went a month without using the A word or the D word, we'd perceive our work in a totally different way. Just imagine we always called it reparation instead of aid every time. That might, I think we can do that. It might not be winnable with some of the mainstream political parties, but they can talk about the language of equality, working to make the world more equal. Global equalization funds, we can, I don't know, social development finance. There are alternatives that can be used, and they don't carry the damage and the harm and the offense that the A word and the D word do. And I think collectively together, we've got the reach to start changing it.
Great. Many thanks, Martin, for those final words. They are very helpful in terms of responding to what has been transpiring. But I just wanted to also reiterate some of the key things that have transpired in this whole conversation. So it's very clear that aid is not the only word that is offensive, that is patronizing. There are many words, and we have work to do. I think that was well articulated by you, Mariam, and has also been brought clearly by Joan. Joan has been a little bit ahead of us. She has been trying to use the right words, even now on the same panel. So thanks for that. I think Dan also brought out, somehow helped us anchor the global South, because this whole issue of problem of the aid language, it impacts us differently. The global North are impacted differently, the communities and the actors. When you come to the South, the impact is different. In the global North, for example, the poor who are also present in the industrialized countries, such as Shem, they become very angry when they see their own government sending billions and billions of money to Somalia or to Ethiopia to go and help the poor there. But they're poor just here on their doorstep. So that I think affects more of the communities in the global North. In the global South, I think that was well articulated by Danny and Joan. Danny, I think, brought it very clear clearly by saying that it is disempowering, okay? It just destroys the accountability relationships between the state and the citizens, those who are ruled. The state feel that they need not to be accountable to the masses. They just need to be accountable to the donor, the one who's sending the money. It also disempowers the communities and the civil society like us, because it kills our agency. We feel that we cannot collectively organize and get ourselves out of this situation and demand that a world becomes more equal, try to address the historical injustices. All these ones are destroyed by this narrative. Joan said something about the inferiority, which we also alluded to. It also leaves you feeling, inferior and powerless and unable to. So it's been a very wonderful delivery from each one of you. So I think we are going to the next session where we will be able to ask each other questions. So feel free to ask your fellow speakers for clarifications, but also for questions. I just wanted to start with Tamam. Tamam, according to you and your experience, you've written a lot. You didn't say that to us, but most of us have come across some of the work that you've written about decolonization in the humanitarian sector and so forth. From your own experience and your perspective, who do you think is supposed to decolonize the aid narrative? The who part is very important.
So I think we are all like we are able to recognize a couple of things. There is a massively entrenched structural racism in our society, and that seeps and penetrates our sector quite profoundly, even if many of the people who are in power in this sector would like to continue denying the existence of that. We use the fact that, this is meant to save lives as a sort of general absolution. We can't be bad if we're trying to save lives. We're trying to save African lives. How can we be racist? And that, let's put that aside. But there's another thing, which is, I don't know anyone who has, had a choice between joining like skinheads or Ku Klux Klan or something, or the humanitarian sector. Most people who join that sector join it out of a genuine desire to be of use outside what they know is like a profit-based careers that exist in most Western countries. Those are people, and this again is one of the sort of evils of the system, of this neo-colonial patriarchal capitalist system, is it takes exactly those people with the purest intentions and makes them cogs in an oppressive machine. They end up serving that structural racism and neo-colonialism. So I say that because I would like to avoid what happens regularly, which is, when someone says there is structural racism, people hear you're calling me racist, and that's not the intention. And if that is a logical step, then the next logical step is everybody's responsibility and should be desire is to rid that system of that stain on it, of that possibility of doing harm. And here, my opinion is that we should avoid making it the job of people of color or people in the global south or people in outside power to teach everybody about what's happening and to make sure that, police the words and actions of everyone else. Let's take a lesson of a long history of Black feminism, for example, that pronounces that, it's not our job to continue the education of white men everywhere forever. If they are unwilling to learn, then that's their problem. And here, I think it's the job of every one of us, of every background, including people who come from privilege, people who come from white bourgeois backgrounds, to say, if you actually meant what you intended in joining this sector, then part of your job is to speak out about its problems. And this is one of the ways this becomes an emancipatory discipline rather than an oppressive one. If all of us owned it, rather than starting, an internal civil war where, you either win if you are from the majority or minority world, which would end up being harmful for everybody and probably more oppressive to people who this sector is supposed to serve. Thanks.
Right, thanks, Tamam, for that. Crystal clear and very understood. Dan, I can see your hand up. You want to change it?
I have a question for Martin, and this is personal in a way, and it reflects on my experience the few times I've been in his country, in the UK. I see a lot of ignorance, of course. I've been spattered in trains, there was a time when there was an Ebola epidemic in Africa, and the way I was treated by people who were adults, someone spitting at you and making all sorts of words. And it points me to something which I see in the Western society. We're talking all about these things, but they're not with us. The public seems to be really detached from the reality. And saying this, I have a sister who's been in Europe for 25 years and raising my 2 nieces. And I was asking, what is the problem with this society? Do people understand? And then she says, the education. There's a big, huge silence about the history of colonization, the history of all these things. So my question to Martin is, we don't want to live a separate world. We want a world which works for all of us. I do not want to get into an agenda that leaves others, then we fight, or then we us against them. How do we collectively move as a human society and have every human being living maybe in the 20 years to come, understanding, and we all work together as humanity, appreciating that we have a history, we have problems, that not this politics that I see in London or whatever, where everyone is looking inwards, us against them, you foreigners, you immigrants, you what? Some people have used funny languages which I cannot use here to describe me. As a visitor, just can you imagine? So I don't know what you can say about the miseducation of the public in the Western world.
Thank you, Danny. It horrifies me that you're treated that way in my country, and I'm sorry that you were. I think Hamimu said some of it, and it's not that all the people are horrible individuals. I think it's the education and the narrative that they're subjected to. So it was possible for Boris Johnson to cut the aid budget, and it was a popular move. It helped him politically to do it. And I think that is a big problem for those who are not necessarily even living in extreme poverty, but just aren't that well off in the UK. The aid narrative divides them from people in other parts of the world. It tells them that it's right for our government to take, I know it's only a small amount, 0.7%, but it's billions, 14 billion pounds, sounds like a fortune to ordinary people in the UK. So the public narrative that's everywhere is that money has been taken from your country where you're living in poverty and you're in need and given here. And there's a sense of almost a moral outrage against it because it just goes to corrupt dictators. It can't change anything, can it? Because we've been doing it for decades and there's still poverty there, so it's not working. And it's just a poisonous narrative. It tells a lie. It hides the fact that our country is taking more from Africa than it gives. Africa's aiding the UK, if we're going to use the language of aid. So it perpetuates a political lie, it's bad information, and it divides people. Now, if instead, we label it as DFID, if the Labour Party introduces a new DFID, if instead it says that it won't be about aid, it'll be about tackling inequality, holding the elite to account, holding power to account, clamping down on tax dodging, and yes, absolutely extending solidarity initiatives to those currently forced into poverty. If it's framed that way, that narrative puts ordinary people in the UK on the same side as people living in poverty around the world, because we're all victims of that extreme inequality. So I think a lot of it is narrative, and that same narrative, absolutely extends to migrants. So not only have they been living off me for years, they're now coming to my country too. It fuels hatred. The aid narrative fuels hatred. It fuels racism. And as a sector, we say that we're trying to eliminate racism, and we use language all the time that fuels it. We've got to stop.
All right, thanks a lot, Martin, for that response. I can't add much, but if there's someone who wants to respond to such a question very quickly, you could do that. I can see Mariam, your hand is up. Then we shall ask you, every speaker, to say their last word in 1 minute. And then we close the panel and open up to the discussion with the audience. Mariam?
I was just going to very quickly say that the sad thing is if you get, people in a country to hate each other, or the minority, or the person that's coming over and stealing their job, or the person that's a different color, it means that they're so busy hating each other, they're not really paying attention to what's going on in terms of, the policies and the legislation that's being pushed through, that's actually making them poorer and is making their lives worse. So there's something in there that it's much easier to perpetuate certain narratives about others and othering people, because then it avoids people from looking at what the actual problems are. And you see this everywhere. It's the same game that a lot of countries will play, and I'm from, ethnically from Pakistan. They do it over there. As soon as the polls are dipping for, Imran Khan, they'll start talking about India and how we're at war there and how, we need to bolster our defenses. So it's a similar kind of thing that happens in so many countries, and it definitely happens in the UK, no doubt about it. So I just wanted to put that out there, as it's really upsetting and frustrating and devastating to get that happen to you. And this is sadly, tragically, a symptom of what's going on in the UK politically at the moment.
All right, thanks, Mariam. I think before you leave it at that, would you have your final words? In 1 minute.
Do you want to call names, or should we just jump in?
I asked Mariam, but I think she's struggling to turn on.
Oh, sorry. I thought you were going to call names. So in a nutshell, very quickly, I completely agree, and I saw in lots of the comments, language is not going to be the silver bullet that suddenly makes the world more equal and takes out the inherent colonialism that still exists in a lot of the language and the practices that happen, and avoids putting what we need to do, which is actually, decisions around what good development projects, I hate using the word development, but I can't think of a different one right now, but what good projects look like, what good education looks like, what good proper livelihood should look like in the hands of the communities that are actually living and understand and know and are the experts of what needs to happen, really. So this isn't a silver bullet, but it's the framing and the mindset and the things that you perpetuate by using language that is inaccurate, perpetuates racism and the colonial agenda. Even if it's unintentionally, it still does it. And I do think that there was another comment about, it's not just about, it shouldn't just be about how you feel. I think actually being self-aware of things that make you feel uncomfortable and addressing it is so important, because we've spent so many years just ignoring that uncomfortable feeling. And my hope is that we acknowledge it, but not just acknowledge it, we do something about it. And from what I've seen, speaking to lots of people in the UK, in other countries, it does feel like something has changed. And maybe I'm just the internal optimist, incredibly naive, but I would rather be that way than think that things are always going to be the way they are forever, because that's the thing that keeps me going and sustains this agenda for me. So I'm going to put that out there.
Thanks a lot. Joanne, your final word in 1 minute.
Yeah, I think I'm still very much in favor of what Martin offered, that, we should be very intentional about choosing the words that we're using in our communications work. I know that it's probably going to impact in terms of the audience that we're speaking to, and I think it might mean that we have to look at our audience again and sort of be patient through the process. But I'm very much in favor of, having a dictionary of sorts or having a manifesto within the aid sector, with the language that we want to move towards, the language of global solidarity, which is what we're moving towards. And I think that it is possible, because there are, pockets of communities like the one, the Healing Solidarity Collective, what Bond is doing also with Black and Brown professionals or people in the sector who want to reimagine communications. So, we have all these communities, and I think there is so much knowledge that can be harnessed and can be packaged, and we can move forward with that and have much more bolder and solidarity-like language.
Okay, thanks a lot for that submission. Tamam?
I will argue here that, language is a symptom, and it's a symptom that doesn't perpetuate itself out of humanitarianism or aid itself. It is a symptom of a very clear neoliberal system that is creating a precarious life where we navigate on the edge of surviving or struggling. And the language was one of the ways that is used. The 15 billions that were cut were demonstrated as a massive amount in aid in the UK. Trident, the nuclear system of submarines, which has never been used, will never be used, is 200 billion. And the same people who wanted to save the 15 billion are happy to spend the 200 billion. Global aid for health is 20 billion. The 100 richest billionaires in the US made 2 trillion, 2,000 billion during the COVID pandemic. The money that is spent on aid is pennies, and it's spent happily because it keeps the illusion of the powers being able to, being benevolent while they control people and prevent the revolt, the resistance. So I'll just quote one sentence from a 1979 commentary on the humanitarian principles by Jean Pictet of the ICRC. And he says, one cannot be at one and the same time the champion of justice and of charity. One must choose, and the ICRC has long since chosen to be the defender of charity. This is still there. Many people will deny that this is still relevant, but aid has chosen to avoid talking about justice, and that cannot be anymore. It's a ludicrous idea for us to say our job is to save lives just so they go and be grinded by a global hegemonic system that uses them as markets and labor, and that's fine by us. And not now, not ever, and definitely well, we are going to face a climate crisis that will make the crisis of today look ridiculous in 10 or 20 years. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Tamam. I'll come for that quote. I really need it for furthering my campaigns. So I'll look out for you. Martin, then Danny.
Okay, just 2 quick things from me. Then, I think as steps to move forward, then I think one thing is that we just need to have our own little cheat sheet of a few alternative words. So then when we need to find them quickly while we're talking, they pop into our heads. So, development projects, social justice projects are due. development sector, global equity sector, aid, reparation payments, social development finance, solidarity contributions. There's a range of things. We just need to choose a few and start using them. If we all start using alternatives, they'll start to catch on. So I think that's one thing. But I also think we do need some, you've got to organize in politics. I think we need some organized initiatives to change the behavior of our sector. So I don't know if that could be something like an organized pledge or something, or a badge that organizations are, challenged to make. Will you sign the pledge? Will you put this on your website? We commit to not use the A or the D words. I don't know, but some kind of organized initiatives that really challenge our behavior. And because I think just wanting to, when we're talking about it now, we need constant reminders. And I think we need basically some of the key organizations with the big budgets that get the language out all over the place and set culture. They need to stop using those words, and we need to get them to. And I think we've got the power to get them to, but we'll have to organize.
Great, thanks. Danny?
Yeah, thank you, Matt. And I'm going to begin on that last word. And I'm remembering a quote from someone, I cannot place it. Two quotes. One is that someone said, never underestimate the power of human stupidity. And another quote, someone said, the most common way people give up power is when give up their power is by thinking they don't have any. And I am reflecting now, thinking about the language, and I'm looking at, a language of 10 or 50 million Anglo-Saxons, taking over the world and spoken by billions of people, but the 20 or 30 or 50 or 60 or 100 million Yoruba language means nothing to anybody. And I remember, a couple of months back, the Chinese were also developing and launching their aid sort of agency and something like. So I had an opportunity to speak to one of the Chinese in the space here in Uganda, and he's trying to look something around aid in Africa and the like. And I said, are you not also trying to grow another aid, space that is going to colonize? And he told me, you Africans don't learn anything from us. Until you get the power, nobody listens to the weak. So I think I can end on that and say, Africans, I think it's time to relook into our own weaknesses and see how do we claim the power? So how do we believe that we have the power? The whole conversation about language, or who has what to speak, when to speak, what do you say, will simply dissipate, just like it is seemingly dissipating with the Chinese. I end on that. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure meeting all of you and having a wonderful discussion. I'm sorry my camera is off. I live in a developing world. Somebody decided to switch off the power when I'm in the middle of a conversation. So I don't know what it is. That's the challenge we live with. Thank you. In the name of my ancestors, I wish you all the best.
Thank you. Likewise.
Great, thanks a lot, everyone. We haven't received Q&A, but there are questions that have been coming through the chat box. We've run out of time. But if I could read very quickly from Firoz Manji, using a different word does not stop aid always being an instrument of foreign policy and the rationale for the white savior industry. That one came in from Firoz Manji. There's one that has come in from Jennifer Letva. In some ways, I believe we need to really see our high-minded rhetoric in the sector for what it is and what it isn't, and turn to describing the specifics of practice and what it looks like. The different choices we can make, okay? To the panelists, posing a question. When it comes to reimagining solidarity, what does it look like day to day for you and your practice? That's from Jennifer. Yeah, so any quick reactions to those two important questions? I'll give 1 minute for any person who is ready to respond to that, and then we shall move on. The first one came from Firoz Manji. Using a different word does not stop aid always being an instrument of foreign policy and the rationale for the white savior industry.
Okay, I'll respond to Jennifer's question with particular reference to communications work. So what I've realized, I was working on a story a few months ago, just speaking to different Black women NGO leaders, and one of them happened to be Muslim, and I really wanted to tell her story. I really wanted to write, because she gave me a lot of insights about, working in the sector, first of all, as a Black woman, but then, her faith also, how that kind of played out in terms of how she had to find ways to navigate, like during networking, she couldn't, for example, just shake people's hands, and then she was treated differently and that sort of thing. And then she kind of had to find different ways to get funding for her programs. So in the end, I decided not to tell her story, particularly, for her as a Muslim woman, because I realized that I'm not the right person to do that. I would rather that she does that or another Muslim woman does that, because then I think that they're able to to give it the full sort of, they're able to do it justice from a different and authentic perspective than I would be able to. So one of the things that I'm trying to be intentional about is I ask myself, am I the right person to tell the story? And does the story actually need to be told? Because I don't think everything has to be told, and I don't think I'm always the right person to tell the story. Yeah.
Great, many thanks. All right, to Firoz Manji, I think partly as a listener, I think partly that has been answered. I think with the right terminology and language, I think we can start to mobilize and engaging the powers that are and try to do things differently. So it's a continuous process. One last turn up. Okay, so about Danny, I think you asked about the question about the ignorant community in the UK that doesn't know what is going on. And Martin said that's the problem of aid. They are angry, they don't know what's going on. And this is part of the answer to, part of the process of resolving that. But I think there is a message inside the chat box. We also have some education. So there's some resources that have been put in place to try and educate the British public about the historical contribution of their own government, the colonial kind of stuff they did all over the world, and how this is impacting poverty, and affecting migration. We're having a migration crisis at the moment. Some say that people are following some of the illicit flows from Africa. So the migrants have got to jump on the risky boats and follow it wherever it has been taken. So the other one is an appreciation chat from PCA. Many thanks, Masudi, Joanne, Mariam, Monica, in absentia, Dr. Danny Gauto, Martin, Tamam, audience, teams behind the scenes with gratitude, Portia, and she signed out. So the recording will be available. And because of time, unless if someone has a burning issue. Did you want to say something, Tamam?
I just feel that we haven't completely, part of the issue of finding a solution is acknowledging that there isn't a solution that is universal and applicable everywhere. And that is intentional. This is not a pragmatic issue. This is intentional. The ideas of universalism and stuff that apply everywhere to the whole of humanity is a Western colonialist idea. And I will quote some of the Latin American brilliant post-colonial thinkers like Boaventura de Sousa Santos and Miguel Gresfogel and others, who talk about why are we in a time where effectively the thought of middle-aged men from 5 countries in Europe have become the universal knowledge that applies to everything. And all other knowledge, thousands of years of history, have become sort of local, tribal, ethnic, whatever you want to call it. Departing from the universality and addressing issues in every way we find them and they mean something to us is in itself an act of rebelling against this language. Sitting there and finding, I'll give you an example. In MSF, when I was there, the association, which is a very French concept and construct, has always been sort of the voluntary part of the organization. And it's never existed in the Middle East. And when we sat, Arabic-speaking MSFers from the Middle East, I decided that neither does the structure of an association, nor does its name mean something. And this is reappropriating our language, because you know what? In Western organizations, they may have a meeting and they call it a baobab because it resembles supposedly a meeting in the field under a baobab tree, or they create a platform and they call it souk, which is an Arabic word, without really knowing. They appropriate our language, which is only used as a metaphor for something. We own it back, and we called it a majlis. A majlis is a place in an Arabic culture where everybody sits on the floor and everybody is equal, regardless to their social status, regardless to where they sit in the hierarchy. It doesn't need elections, it needs a deliberation, which is how we did things historically. We didn't vote on stuff, we sat in those places and we discussed things on equal terms. We reappropriate our habits, we force them to become more known and more, whether that is how we dress, whether that is how we speak, whether owning our, the names. And this is known now. It's been done in the social justice movement, in the Black liberation movement, in the feminist movement. We have ways of doing that that are inspiring and positive and powerful. And not everything needs to be, we shouldn't be made to fight every day, to struggle every day, to be put down every day. There is an aspects of owning our identity that are joyful and annoying to everybody else, which is part of the purpose. And because none of us can spend our lives fighting every day. It's just demoralizing and terrifying perspective. So we end up leaving it to the exact people who keep it as it is. Sorry for speaking too much. I apologize.
No worries, it's worth it. I think we need to end it here and respect every person's schedules after this. But I want to end it by thanking my panelists. Thank you very much for honoring our call when we reached out to you to come and discuss this subject and be involved in this conversation. True to what we hoped, you've not disappointed. It's been a great conversation. Thank you for bringing all your knowledge on this panel and helping us address this issue. We also thank greatly our panel, our audiences, the people who have made this conversation possible. We wouldn't speak to ourselves. I think you've given us an ear, and the feedback that you've been dropping into the chat box has all helped us understand, but also make us a little bit confident of what we are doing. So thanks a lot. The names, the list is long, I can't read everything, but thanks a lot for turning up, giving us your time.